How to weave in tails. Hi everyone, my name is Norman. I run the blog nimbleneedles.com, and today I prepared quite a lot of swatches because I want to show you 10 different ways to weave in tails. Securing the ends is a vital part of every knitting project. But since different knitting patterns end up with a different number of tails in different positions, it's important to realize that there is not the one best way to weave in tails. Instead, it depends on your project, and that's why I will show you a couple of different ways to hide those annoying ends. How to do it for stockinette stitch, ribbing, garter stitch, when you're doing color work, lace, or even when you're knitting with a really slippery yarn. And the best part, 3 of these methods are done on the fly, so you never end up picking up the tapestry needle. So let's dive right into it. Now, the first method to weave in tails is by far the easiest. If you use a standard long tail cast on, then your tail always hangs down here at the start of your first round or row. So instead of weaving in the tail later on, you can pick up the tail and knit the first couple of stitches or even the whole first round with 2 strands held together. So you knit it the regular way, but you knit with 2 strands held together like this. Of course, this will result in stitches that are a tiny bit more visible than the rest of your fabric. However, most other weaving in techniques reinforce your fabric one way or another as well. So in the end, that's nothing you can avoid either way. But if you knit across the whole first round with 2 strands held together, you will barely notice it, at least not in a very negative way. Here is a swatch where I did exactly this, and as you can see, it looks really pretty. This method is great for projects where you don't need a really stretchy cast on. So I wouldn't use this for socks or something like that, but if you're knitting a scarf or a coaster, then this method is really great. And here at the end of the row, you can simply cut the rest of the tail and continue knitting like you normally would. Method number 2, hide the tails in the seam. I already mentioned that weaving in the tails always reinforces your fabric a bit. So whenever possible, try to change yarn in a way your tails end up here on the edges. That's because a lot of knitting projects are seamed, sweaters for example, but also toys. And there are 2 things you can do with that tail. First of all, you can use the cast on tail to do the seaming. For example, we could join these 2 pieces using mattress stitch, and if I use the cast on tail, I can combine weaving in and doing the seaming. So I joined together these 2 pieces using mattress stitch. This is what it looks like now. And there, as you can see, is a big seam on the back side, and you can hide all these tails here. Imagine you're knitting a big striped sweater or a Fair Isle sweater, and you can hide all these tails here in that seam. Simply go through the seam a couple of times. You can even squeeze in a knot or so. You can also go into that direction. Just go in a couple of times either way. You even can tie a knot, like I said, and then once you're satisfied, just cut the yarn. There's one important note here. This will reinforce this seam here. Seams are typically less stretchy than the rest of your fabric, so be careful with this technique so you don't create too sturdy a seam. For example, if this was the shoulder seam of a sweater, I probably wouldn't do it like this. But for all seams where it doesn't matter if it's a bit stiffer, this is a perfect technique. Method number 3, join in the yarn the right way. So often you end up with a tail in the middle of a project. that's when your yarn runs out and you need to join in another ball. Now, I told you to change yarn at the end and the beginning of a row just a second ago, and that's always a good choice, but sometimes there are no seams where you can hide the tails. In this case, you can learn a proper joining method, and one of my personal favorite one is felting the join. So, to felt two ends together, you need to pick the ends apart so they look a bit like a fan. So like this, pick it apart, so like this. And then you need to dip them into water, or better use some spit. I'm not going to do that. I'll dip it into water here for you. And then stack these two ends on top of each other, and then place them in the palm of your hands, and then rub it really fast. Rub it really fast to create some heat and friction, and this will create a secure and permanent join, and then you can simply continue knitting. So this method only works for organic and feltable fibers, so if you're knitting with acrylic yarn or superwash, it doesn't work. But then you could look into the Russian join method for a very similar effect. Method number 4, weave in tails as you go. So here I am at the start of a new round, and I want to join in a new color because I don't know, I want to knit some pretty stripes. So what I do is I start knitting just the way I normally would, but with every stitch I do, I cross the tail here with my working yarn. So I knit one stitch and then I cross the yarn. I knit one stitch and then I cross the yarn. And this will create little floats here on the back side that trap the yarn and secure it. So this is a really great technique if you're knitting with really fussy yarns, colorways, and especially projects that are not reversible, because I mean you obviously notice it from the backside. And if you're familiar with Fair Isle or stranded knitting, then you should already know this technique because you do actually just creating floats. And once you covered, I don't know, 10 or so stitches, you can simply cut the tail and continue knitting with your new yarn. Now, what if you're knitting a project in stockinette stitch and all the 4 methods I showed you before don't work for whatever reason, and you end up with tails here in the middle and at the start and end of your project? Well, this is the time you need to pick up your tapestry needle and actually start weaving in the ends. There is no way around it. There are 4 rules you need to observe. So the first rule is always hide the tails on the wrong side. Second rule, use a sharp tapestry needle. You will find a link to the ones I'm using in the description below. Most tapestry needles are blunt and they are lovely for doing things like the Kitchener stitch, mattress stitch, duplicate stitch, and so on. But as you will see in a second, when weaving in the ends, I always go right through the yarn, and that's where you really need a sharp tapestry needle. Third rule is always go diagonally and always go into 2 directions. And the fourth rule is never pull tight. So let's do that. I thread my tail on a tapestry needle, and now I will go through these purl bumps here diagonally. So here's what I do. I go right through these purl bumps, and that's why you need a sharp tapestry needle. And as you can see, I don't weave around the purl bumps, I go right through them. Weaving in is all about creating friction, and by going through the yarn, you just add one layer, an extra layer of security. You don't need to go too far, but you should cover at least 5 or 6 stitches. And then you can pull the yarn through. And then you need to go into a different direction. This can be the same direction you came from, or you go at a right angle. Let's do that. So I go into the second direction, and this really has 2 reasons. First of all, the more stitches you cover, the securer your weave-in will be. And the second reason is you will end up pulling on your knitting one way or another. And if you go into two direction, only half of it is affected. So that's really nice. And here's the fourth rule I mentioned. Never pull too tight. So as I pull the yarn through, I keep a little loop here. And instead of pulling on the tail, I stretch out the fabric a bit, and then your tail will settle in. And then you can cut the tail, because if you pull on the tail too tightly, let's do this. Then, as you can see, or I hope you can see, then you will stretch these stitches here, and that's not what you want. You want this to be as invisible as possible on the right side, and that's why you always should stretch out your tail before you cut it. So this is what it looks like on the wrong side now, and here we have the right side. And as you can see, even if you stretch out your knitting, it is barely visible, and that's what proper weaving in should look like. One more important note. Some people will tell you to hide the tail here in the edges, and that's something I almost never do for various reasons. First of all, the edges are part of the fabric that often experience the most wear and tear. And then often you will add selvage stitches and so on. So the fabric here is a little different, often looser. So I generally don't think it's a good idea, especially as you often end up with these little tails sticking out here of the fabric, and I just don't feel that's pretty. Now, before I go on with 5 more techniques, I quickly wanted to remind you that shooting these videos takes a lot of time and effort. So, if you want to support my work and help me producing more of these tutorials, why don't you like this video right now, leave a nice comment, or even subscribe to my channel. Now, the method I showed you before works great for stockinette stitch, but what if you're knitting a project in ribbing? Well, for ribbing, I pick one rib, and then I go through each little stitch of the rib, and again, I go right through the stitches. I go right through the stitches, then I pull the tail through, and then I go one more time into the other direction like this. So again, go through each little stitch one at a time. One at a time. Then pull the tail through. And again, don't pull too tight. Instead, stretch out the ribbing, stretch out your project a bit, and let your tail settle in. And only then can you cut the tail. And this is what it looks like. Now, I think it's barely visible and a great way. And there's one important thing you should know. In ribbing, you absolutely don't want to go horizontally when you weave in the tails. It's a very stretchy fabric used for hems and cuffs, and if you weave in the tails in the same direction, you will stretch out your ribbing. Well, that's going to spell disaster. So what about garter stitch? Garter stitch is the easiest knitting stitch, but it's actually not the easiest to hide tails. First of all, it's a reversible fabric, so you absolutely want to make sure it's pretty from both sides. And then, while there are these little purl bumps here, like in stockinette stitch, they are much farther apart. I've seen so many tutorials showing you to go diagonally through these or around these purl bumps, but I think it's just such a bad idea, not only because it's very visible, but also because it's not very secure, because you always need to bridge that big gap, especially if you're using a slippery yarn. So here's what I do instead. Here's a rib and here's a rib, and if you pull these apart, you can see knit stitches in between. And what I do is I thread my yarn on a tapestry needle, and then I go through these legs. I go right through these legs of these knit stitches. I'm not weaving around them. I go right through them like this, and then you can pull it through, and that's how it looks like. Now you could go into the other direction here like this, or a couple of more stitches into the same direction, because as you can see, it stretches out the rib a bit, so it is not totally invisible. Still, I feel this method is superior to all other methods for garter stitch, and it doesn't involve nonsense like using duplicate stitch that will be very visible and not very secure. Number 8, color work. When you're working with multiple colors, the technique for weaving in the tails is almost the same. No matter if it's in Taja, stripes, Fair Isle, entrelac or whatever, you typically end up with quite a lot of tails. But since most of the colorwork techniques actually rely on stockinette stitch, you can just weave in the tails on the back side, going diagonally just the way I showed you before, and call it a day. There are two things you really need to be aware of. First of all, if possible, try to weave in the tails in the corresponding panel, because so here I weave in the red tail here in the red panel, because if I was to weave in the tail here in the green, let me show you quickly, then the red might peek through, and you don't want that. I mean, only if you stretch it, but you will end up stretching your knitting. And the second really important thing is you need a proper joining method. For this red color block here, I didn't use a joining method. I just stopped knitting with the green yarn and then started knitting with the red yarn. And if you do that, you end up with a hole here, because there's nothing to anchor that stitch. And as you weave in the tail, you pull that stitch in that direction, and here the same on the top. So here's what I do. One stitch before I need to start my new color block, I pick up the tail of the second color and place it in between my knitting needle and my working yarn, and then I knit one stitch. And then as I need to switch to the next color, I twist it around the old color 1 or 2 times, and then I tuck on the tails and continue knitting with my new color. And this will trap the yarn here on the back side, and it really will serve two purposes. First of all, it will create a really firm first stitch, so it's much easier to knit that stitch in the next round, and the join will be much neater, and you won't end up with holes as you weave in the tails. And when I'm knitting stripes or Fair Isle or whatever, I knit across one row without a special joining method. But while the stitches are still on the needle, I tie a simple knot here to secure the first stitch. I will unravel this knot later on before I weave in the tails, but for now this simple knot keeps this stitch anchored, and you don't end up with these huge stitches here at the beginning of your row. So how to weave in tails in lace? It's very hard to find the right way to weave in ends on lace. First of all, you are usually knitting with a much looser gauge, and then there are usually quite a lot of eyelets that prevent you from using all the other methods I showed you. You have a couple of different options. If your pattern is not very lacy, meaning there are larger stretches of garter stitch or stockinette stitch in between, you can try to position your tails in a way so that you can weave them in through those sections on the wrong side, just the way I showed you before. So pick up your tapestry needle and go through those pearl bumps and split them as you go. Here, this is especially important because otherwise your tail will come loose. Also, of course, don't pull tight because otherwise you will ruin your lace. That's not what you want. Now, if you don't have larger stretches of stockinette stitch, or your lace is just too lacy, then you have to switch to weaving in tails using duplicate stitch. And I'm switching to sturdier cotton yarn here so you can really see what I'm doing. So you have to trace all your stitches, or graft them, or duplicate stitch, however you want to call it, and really trace every single stitch with your needle one at a time. And this will be a bit time consuming, especially considering that a lot of lace patterns, they have rather complicated stitches, so there are tons of knits and purls, knit two togethers, and so on. So doing duplicate stitches in these cases is often quite difficult, but it is really your only option. Now, difficult to do this while talking. So this is how it would look like, and this is a really nice option when you're knitting with a very fussy yarn. But if you are knitting with cotton or any other type of slippery yarn, doing duplicate stitches alone might actually not be enough. So you have to tie knots as you go, and I'll show you this method in a second with cotton yarn. But as a general rule, I would avoid ending up with any tails when knitting real lace. So use the Russian join or the felted join whenever possible, knit in the cast-on tail, and so on. And if you really need to weave in tails, maybe because you're knitting in 2 colors or so, then consider weaving in tails after you block things, because often tails come undone after you wash things and you stretch things out. So be careful when you weave in tails anyway. The last and probably hardest thing to weave in is cotton. Cotton is very slippery, it doesn't felt, and on top of that it stretches out quite a bit as you wash it. So the tails are often flying around this way and that way. Cotton and lace is the only exception to my rule to not tie knots, but you have to combine them with regular weaving in methods. So I've been working with cotton the whole time here, but imagine this is my first time weaving in a cotton tail here. So what I do is I weave in the tail just the way I did before, but now you have to split that tail into 2 parts. So untwist your plied yarn. This can be into 2 parts. This can be a bit tricky, and it will take quite a bit of time. So you have to untwist these ends. So I separated my tail into 2 parts, and now you can simply pick up either part and then go through around 1 more stitch, just 1 more stitch, and then tie a knot. Tie a really nice and tight knot here. Tie a tight knot, and then continue weaving in a couple of more stitches. Like so. And then you can pick up the second part of your tail and do this however often you think you require. So take this part of the tail and go through the stitches 1 more time. So like this. And then tie another knot around that little pearl bump. Tie a knot. and continue however long you feel you need. Make sure that you stretch out the tail before you tie the knot so you don't end up puckering the fabric. But other than that, this is a really secure way to weave in tails for cotton. This is of course a last resort method. In cotton, I would always try to hide the tails in the seams and so on, or in the cast on edge. But if that is not possible, you have to squeeze in a knot or two and then weave in the tail for a couple of more stitches. I will have to say that a lot of the problems people have with weaving in cotton yarn are related to the fact that for whatever reason people especially in the US, weave in tails with blunt tapestry needle and they go around the bumps instead of right through them. And I'm not sure how and why this got popular, maybe because it's easier, but you know, if you actually split the yarn as you weave in tails, you don't necessarily need to tie those knots even if you are weaving in cotton tails. Anyway, that were 10 ways to weave in tails. Please give me a big thumbs up if you enjoyed watching, comment with your questions and your feedback, and of course consider subscribing to my channel in case you don't want to miss any new videos. Happy knitting and enjoy the rest of your day.